All right, everybody. Now that we've talked a decent amount about all these various types of seventh chords and how to spell them, how to conceptualize them, all that stuff, we want to get specific here and actually look at how to use some of them. And so we're going to start by talking about by far the most commonly used type of seventh chord across pretty much all styles. And this would be the dominant seventh chord. Now, something that I think is really interesting about this, as you probably saw on Friday or last week when we were doing our sort of seventh chords in keys type of work and seeing on what scale degree in both major and minor keys do we actually find these seventh chords. You may have noticed that in each key, there was only one dominant seventh chord, which already is kind of unique because it seems a little counterintuitive that the chord that we're saying is the most common and the most important is also the least sort of represented in a key. But it's actually that factor which makes it so useful because it really, really, really stands out. So that's a big part of why it's so common, because it's different from the other chords, and therefore it really draws attention to itself in a positive way. We're going to sort of look at some of the specific note things that it contains, down the line here in relationship to why it's so useful. But that's just something that really is unique about it. We probably also should have been clued into its importance by the name that we give it, the dominant seventh chord, which we know that dominant in music really sort of relates to five, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that it sort of conquers all the others, but in a way it does, because five, the fifth scale degree, is such a structurally important place in harmony, and we know that that five chord is the chord that most commonly leads us back to one. So it's in a really, really critical place function-wise. So it makes sense that the type of seventh chord that we would use the most is kind of paired up with a really, really strong functional harmonic chord, for lack of a better word. So let's get into it here and talk about a little bit of what's going on with this chord and what we need to be looking out for. We're just going to sort of talk generally in this video, and then we'll do some examples in the next video. So we're really talking, how do we use 5/7? We already said that it's a dominant seventh chord. You can see up here in the title of the slide the way that we notate it. Remember, with dominant seventh chords, part of the reason that we can tell that it's so important is that we don't really qualify its title. We just write 5/7. And that 7, we don't put major 7, we don't put minor 7, we don't put, anything. We don't put half diminished. There's no special sign. If we just call something a 5/7 chord, or if we just call something, for instance, a C7, that means it's a dominant seventh chord, which sort of, again, comes back to highlighting just how important it is, right? And how common it is. So the beauty of using seventh chords is that we're not really going to be looking at any new functional ideas. What I generally say about adding sevenths to harmony in sort of functional harmony is that instead of changing the function of a chord, meaning instead of making it so that now 5 wants to go somewhere else, instead it deepens the function of a chord. So when we put a seventh on the 5 chord, it only makes 5 want to go to a root position 1 or 6 even more strongly, right? It really, really contributes to that amazingly strong push to 1 as like a traditional authentic cadence, or moving into 6 in deceptive motion. But both of those progressions, both of those types of motion, are deepened with the addition of a seventh. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So it can feel like we're really sort of incorporating this new technique into our music, but really we're adding a technique that deepens what we're already doing, functionally speaking. The place, though, that we're going to see the biggest change is with the voice leading. And there are some pretty specific voice leading aspects that we will need to consider now that we add the 5/7. But again, I'm going to just sort of cut this off at the pass here and say a little bit that I actually think that having this really specific type of chord, the dominant 7th chord, can actually in some ways make the voice leading easier. It definitely, we're adding more stuff. So in that sense, it's, we can sometimes interpret easiness as like not having to think about a lot of things, which this is not, because there are going to be some very, very, very clear ideas that we want to follow. But the beauty is that with more clarity can a lot of the time come more not simplicity, but it can be more straightforward, because we're going to know that specific notes want to go very, very, very certain places. And that can be very nice because we don't have to think about it as much. So that's sort of the balance that we're striking here. So let's talk a little bit about just some of the ways, again, that the 5/7 chord is actually something that we've secretly already used a little bit here. And again, this just goes back to the idea that the 5/7 chord, even though it's not the one that occurs in a key the most naturally or the most common, I mean, it's something that does happen very naturally and is just a very, 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 very common part of the sound. So let's look at some ways that we've already used the 5/7 chord without realizing it. And the way that this happens is that we could say that it in some ways develops out of a passing tone. So let's look at 3 musical examples here. We're in the key of E flat major, which sounds a whole lot like that. So here we go. In the first example, we've got just nice triads, 2, 5, 1. So here's 2, 5 to 1. These are all just triads, right? No sevenths anywhere. Everything is nice. But it's a little stale. So in the middle measure here, if we look up at the soprano part, we can see that whoever wrote this part writing, no way of knowing who that was, whoever wrote this noticed that there was a third between B flat and G. So we had A flat, B flat, G, or Fa, Sol, Mi. And when we've got a third, we can put a passing tone. So we've got, right, with this A flat passing between B flat and G, and that's going to make it sound like this. Right? So very common. Very common passing tone. But what we can do is realize that A flat, we talk about these passing tones, we talk about all the non-harmonic tones as being something that is definitively not in the chord. And that's true. But sometimes we can actually sort of be a little sneaky and realize that there are ways to maybe understand them as more closely related than we might originally think. And for me, this comes down to actually a really simple math element, which is that in a key, in E flat major, we're using 7 different notes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then there's another E flat on top for fun. There's only 7 notes. And so no matter how we combine things, we're always gonna, notes are more related than they might otherwise be if there were more, right? So we've got 7 notes. A normal triad, like a B flat triad, for instance, is already using 3 out of the 7 different notes, right? Each chord, each triad in the key of E flat major is using almost half of the entire scale in just that one chord. That's just sort of a simple math thing that maybe is worth stating more explicitly. So to add a 7th, it's not really actually that much of a stretch to realize, well, we're already using almost half of the scale in one chord. The rest of the notes are probably also not as distant than we would expect them to be. And this passing tone is a really great example, because if we just say, what if instead of thinking of this as a passing tone, we instead just made the A flat part of the chord, Would that make sense? So instead of this middle measure where we've got a passing tone, what if we said we just want that A flat, which is in the soprano, to just stay as part of the chord, right? And what we're going to get there is root, B flat, third in the tenors, which is D, fifth in the altos, which is F, and seventh in the sopranos, which is A flat, root, third, fifth, seventh. And what do you know? It's not this sort of passing tone, which is completely separate from the chord anymore. It's a member of the chord because it just adds a seventh to the triad. So if the triad was B flat, D, F, we can add a seventh to it. And there you go. You got 5-7. So this might be maybe a little bit of a stretch for some people, but I think it's really important just to see that everything that we're doing, or adding things here that are from the key, there's a pretty simple way to relate all these ideas to one another. And the seventh, really this idea of dissonance, we're just sort of experimenting with, in some ways, the rhythmic placement, right? Are we placing it off the beat, away from the chord, or are we placing it right on the beat as part of a chord in this case? So let's talk just quickly here about some general characteristics of 5-7, and then in the next video, we'll look at some of the actual voice leading ideas. So generally speaking, here are some things to look out for. Number one, the seventh of the chord, the seventh of the 5-7 chord. And this is where I just want to, again, point out, I'm going to be very carefully consistent with my terminology here, and we're going to see this in a second, why this is so important. So when I say seventh, I am referring to the seventh of the chord, the seventh of the chord. So the other way that some people sometimes use the seventh would be to refer to the key, right? The seventh of the key. But I'm going to be very, very, very clear to always use the term leading tone to refer to the key. So the seventh degree of a major scale in the key we were just in, E flat, would be D natural. I will not call that the seventh. I will call that the leading tone, right? Leading tone refers to scale or key. Seventh refers to chord, like root, third, fifth, seventh, right? That's an important distinction. So when we say here the seventh should always resolve downwards, we mean the seventh of the chord will always resolve downwards. And that will generally be to the third of the one chord. There are other ways to do it, but that's the most common result of resolving the seventh downward. But the thing that should stand out is it does not matter where that seventh is going. It doesn't matter what kind of chord it's going to, what type of chord, what sort of function chord it's going to. The seventh as a pitch, as a member of a chord, wants to resolve downwards by step, all right? Here's another, this is maybe a little bit even more nitty-gritty here, but it's really important because, again, the seventh, even though we're saying it's part of the chord, right? It's part of the harmony that we're using. It's part of the function that we're using. It is still a dissonance, right? So when I think about that seventh, root seventh, that's dissonant. No matter how you slice it, that's a dissonant sound. And we have to be careful with dissonances. That's why with both non-harmonic tones and also seventh chords here, we're using very specific language and specific techniques to make sure that we are sort of getting the most out of these dissonances without them getting in the way or distracting. And so part of that is that we can approach the seventh from upwards, from downwards, wherever. But what we do not want to do is skip or leap to it from above. And part of the reason for that is that it's going to resolve downwards. right? That's its eventual result is that the 7th is going to resolve downwards. So if we're doing this chord, and I've got the 7th right there, let me voice it this way. The 7th is going to go downwards. And so if I'm coming from below, let's say, even if I'm all the way down here, I could go like that. And that makes a lot of sense because the motion goes up, then down. There's a certain balance to it. Ba-da-da. See how it naturally wants to fall? Ba-da-dum. Right? That sort of has a melodic sensibility to it. And similarly, I could step downwards to it. So if I was here, then going here to the 7th and resolving downwards, that makes sense because it's part of that motion. Here I go. Right? It doesn't sound strange because it's part of stepwise motion. But if I was up, I don't know why I chose to sing that note. Let's go from this chord, this note, which I can sing a little better. Here, I'm gonna jump down. Ya-dee-dee. It's not as good because, and that was just a skip. That was from C to A flat because our brain knows that we're skipping over that note on our way down. It's even more pronounced from farther away. So like, yeah, why am I singing this one? It's not as effective. So pardon my falsetto there. But frankly, who doesn't love a good in quotes falsetto? So the 7th should not be jumped to or skipped to from above. And lastly, the big technique thing that we're going to work on in the next video is that the 5-7 chord is going to very, very likely involve an incomplete chord, which could be either the 5-7 chord or the 1 chord that it resolves to. And when we talk about an incomplete chord, what that means is that not all members of the chord or the triad are going to be there. And so the last thought I'm going to leave you with here before we stop this video and we'll start the next one is to think which member of either a triad or a 7th chord is the most likely to sort of work being left out, right? Which member of those chords do we need the least? Sort of run through it. Well, it's probably not going to be the root, right? Because if we don't have the root, we're kind of we don't know what chord it is, right? That's a problem. So it can't be the root. If we think about the 5-7 chord, this is a good example of another reason that we can't leave out another note, which is we can't leave out the 7th because it's not a 5. If we say, oh, this is a 5-7 chord without the 7th, then it's just a 5 chord, right? So that doesn't make any sense. So it's not the root, it's not the 7th. So we're left with thinking about either the 3rd of the chord or the 5th of the chord. And I would hope that to you, one of those is standing out as much more likely to be left out. So let's think, the 3rd and the 5th, what do they each do for us? Well, the 3rd gives us color, right? The 3rd gives us sort of the majorness or the minorness of the triad, right? And the 5th generally is there for stability. And so what we're going to do is we are most likely to leave out the 5th of the chord because it's not as important that we have such clear stability of the triad when we're dealing with 5-7 or 5 and 1 because those are by far the most functionally stable chords, right? Our ears don't need that note to know that I just went from a 5 chord to a 1 chord. And in both of those chords that I just played, there were no 5ths. So I'm playing C7, and there's no G, and F major, and there's no C. So I left the fifth out of both of those chords, and our brains, sorry, we don't share one brain. Our brains had no trouble sort of discerning that those were a C7 chord and an F major chord. So we're going to see that one of the major techniques for part writing with a root position 5/7 chord is the use of incomplete harmonies. Harmonies, chords that are missing the fifth. So that's up in the next video. Let's check it out.